Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 134, brought to you by executive producer Brian Douglas. Thank you very much for your support. just heard A Journey's End from Primordial. This is the Recommendal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And in fact, that can be heard on A Journey's End.
That's right. But our journey will never end because we love doing this show.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And we wanted to kind of do something, actually a country I don't think we've ever gone to before, Ireland.
I don't believe we have.
Yeah, no.
They don't really have a rich musical history in the metal realm.
In the metal realm, yeah. I mean, they certainly have, the Irish punk stuff, the Pogues, and a lot of My Bloody Valentine.
The traditional stuff, too. I mean, the traditional like folk stuff that you can hear in Iron Maiden too, that ding, 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 the jig kind of almost stuff, the pub music almost.
Well, and certainly Primordial, which we'll be doing part 1 tonight of a 2-part series, and we'll get into why, to justify a band that maybe a lot of you haven't even really heard of, and why in the heck are we doing 2 episodes on it. But
length comes into consideration.
Well,
there.
for sure, length. But before I was going to get into that, one thing is that Primordial probably, as you heard in Journey's End there, wears on their sleeve that Celtic folk music, Irish traditional thing. Mm-hmm. It's ingrained in the blood, but it's not done in an obnoxious sort of river dance bullshit kind of way.
Yeah.
And it's not done in sort of a hokey adult contemporary bluegrassy sort of
Fear pan flute shit. I mean, it's this in doing any kind of traditional music in metal, you always run the risk of it being crap or being laughable. And I think what Primordial seems to do really well is they can get right to the heart of what's the essence of that, the folk music, pull that stuff out of it without it being like, putting in flutes and lutes and making it sound like Renaissance fair music or anything.
Yep.
Like they managed to actually kind of make it's almost like the Viking metal equivalent of whatever, the music of the Moors or whatever.
Well, and I think that's what I was going to say, is that it really comes back to sort of like a heathen pagan kind of aspect of looking at music. And if you really want to get into like folk in its essence and what the term folk sort of means, I mean, it's sort of the music of the people in a way. I mean, it's very similar to blues in a sense, and I mean that's why white blues was sort of folk music, and then later adapting to sort of like country music in the Americas, But like you think of like Enslaved that you mentioned, I mean really what they're doing is sort of a traditional folk music of Norway through the sort of scope of the Viking culture and its engagement with sort of Christian culture, and then you look at like Amorphous and how they're drawn upon some of that folk aspects, Yeah,
I mean their entire career has been based on those the Cantalatar or whatever the
Cantlavar and
all this crap. I mean, they've never done a song that's not about something that's not somehow integrated into that.
Yeah,
and they kind of pull off some of the same. It almost seems more of the Irish sound. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's just because it's kind of in the same geographic area or not, or if it's just a very similar type of note. But that kind of chord progression that Iron Maiden uses constantly, and it almost has. It's just I guess just goes back to that kind of traditional. Songs that were handed down that were sung in pubs that were used to tell stories, and that's kind of what a lot of Primordial subject matter too. It's almost like you're reading these scrolls from these groups of people wherever, like kind of telling about this this people were conquered, and it's very it's historical, but it's not like how some bands could be very like Hail of Bullets, for instance, how it's very specific about a certain part of World War II or something,
and it's trying to create an aesthetic of that very era.
This is just kind of a general kind of feeling. I mean, I don't know really it's kind of hard to describe really,
but it's sort of like what I think sadly it's the real honest version minus the hokiness of what Spinal Tap was trying to do with when they do like Stonehenge, or even Led Zeppelin to some extent was able to like tap into that with like Stairway to Heaven and things like that. They were drawing like Celtic folk music and some of the mythical paganistic aspects, and Jimmy Page was into the occult and some of that kind of stuff. And
if you hear somebody like Mellow Candle who is very folky in the sense of you think of 1960s folk, but bringing really the same kind of melodies and harmonies and stuff.
But there was an honesty to Mellow Candle too,
But it did take, I think, the fact that Lee Dorian sang its praises definitely upped its legitimacy for me to some degree. But
I think the purity of the vocals got me, with Mellow Candle and stuff. But and so I think that's what like is encapsulated in what Primordial's like approach to music is, and always sort of has been, no matter what era we're sort of talking about. And just like Enslaved, they're sort of a band that like has their roots in certain things like black metal, like even death metal, like prior to when they were a black metal band and started to kind of, we'll get into that when we start talking about Imrama, but they sort of are adapting out of that same mold that like Enslaved adapted out of, and then they sort of grow and progress in some of the weird, odd directions that Enslaved does, but not really in like the progressive rock or psychedelic rock capabilities, but in their own script. But much like Enslaved writes their own script through the guise of black metal, these guys sort of do the same.
They're similar into both around the aspect or Dismember, where none of their you could put on any of their records and it's not like an instant jump out like, oh, this was the weird one. Yeah, they've got a very consistent kind of arc to their career, I think, and it's been like slight refinement the entire time. Yeah, be it through either songwriting or through the actual production or lengths of songs and things like that.
And I think I remember one thing that I thought was unique about Enslaved early on too is that even though Enslaved would have like a similar like kind of template of sound like you were mentioning before, with like sort of the Bolt Thrower Dismember thing, one thing that Primordial does over the course of their career is it almost seems like every album has a similar sound that's organized around a specific like emotion. Almost when we get into like Storm Before Calm or something, it's very primal, whereas like you get into like Spirit, Earth, Aflame, it's very like sort of like tragic or like conflicting between the Christians and the pagans. That's like sort of the feeling of the whole album. Could be Gathering Wilderness, which we'll get into episode 2, is like sort of like aggressive passion or like a truthful like deep dark beauty, and then To the Nameless Dead is like more pride. It's like Irish pride and epic kind of songs, and so there's always like this feeling or emotion that they kind of organize their thoughts around almost, and it seems to work for them because it gives almost a theme to every record, but yet all of the songs, there's like you said, there's these riffs that are distinctly Primordial that you hear on every single record.
Yeah, they're repeated a lot, but it's the same way that Iron Maiden uses almost that triplet riff, that kind of it's almost like a roll on a banjo. Kind of would be the North American equivalent of that or something. But it's not necessarily the riff, but I think they've played that riff, or at least that chord or whatever the hell I'm not a classically trained musician by any stretch of the imagination, but they're playing that up and down the neck, and they actually similarly to like I don't even know another band that necessarily does this, but taking one concept and refining it to such a degree that you can use the same riff, but depending on how you play it, it can either be like aggressively hostile, or it can be beautiful, or it can be triumphant. Somehow they're able to take that same riff and just slightly tweak it a little bit, and kind of change it's a really interesting kind of like bag of tricks they have with how they've almost like limited themselves that this is what we're going to use, and then it's all a matter of how we play it.
I think like precursors to that and probably big influences for them, would be, and that sort of beauty and simplicity kind of thing would be some of the stuff like that Bathory or Celtic Frost did, where it's barbaric and heathenistic in a way, but yet like there's beautiful moments, there's epic moments, there's really raw, just like really under the skin, raw beauty, kind of bitter sort of moments. Yeah. And they don't deviate too far from the script, at least in like the traditional Bathory era, like up maybe kind of into the Viking stuff with Hammerheart, and then with Frost kind of up to into the Pandemonium, and then skipping ahead to like Monotheist and stuff like that. I mean, even Vanity Nemesis has some of that too, but
Vanity Nemesis has some good riffs on it.
Sure, for sure. But you can almost always hear that it's a Bathory song, or it's always a Celtic Frost song.
Totally.
You just kind of tell by the tone of things, but yet they just do those accentuations a little bit, But it's interesting because this is a band that it's weird. Mark and I were sort of commenting before we started recording, like why haven't these guys become more popular? Is it because they haven't toured much in America? They seem to have the same kind of skill set that I mean they have these parts of their sound that you could find in, say, Opeth or in Enslaved or in Anathema or in Amorphous we mentioned earlier,
Might Iron Bride,
especially vocally in terms of that style or approach,
But they seem to be like cater-made to be a fantastic live act, which I've heard they're really good live, but it would make sense. But they've only had a couple of like mini tours throughout the States or hitting festivals and things like that, and they should be on par with Enslaved and some of these other bands. But I think it comes down to that they're too because Enslaved has a little bit more, I guess, outside the box thinking, and you can like interpret their songs a little more.
Well,
these are very direct and straightforward.
And Enslaved has an appeal to like the Rush Tool crowd too, you know, and Radiohead and some of like
they have the whole the enigma
like
of being, you know, part of the original or the second wave Norwegian death metal thing or black metal scene. So I think that is going for him as well.
I mean, what spotlight does Ireland have on anything? You know what I mean? Other than like say Skyclad and some of the other, you know, rare metal bands that have sort of come out of that country where they've never really had much of a scene, you know, to be organized.
U2 come out of there as well?
Yeah, I mean, in the early 80s and stuff, and My Bloody Valentine, and certainly like great acts have come out of Ireland, but yeah, for metal there's not a ton. There was I gotta imagine they're from the same area. Krukan back in the day was kind of another one of these bands that was very kind of folky / black metal, which the first record, from my recollection, it's been a long time, was pretty sweet. And I remember that being kind of the next thing that, okay, we heard this and then we heard Primordial. They kind of perfected that idea. But now, was that put out around the time of the debut from Primordial, which was 95?
I think it was before that. I think it was like 93 or 94 that came out. But that was kind of, there's like a little bit of a bubbling scene there where it was something that, okay, what we've done, you know, gore metal, we've done all this kind of crap, doom had kind of come in, what are we going to do next? That was kind of like the next, you know, big thing after, you know, black metal and for us, but it wasn't a big thing, it was just a tiny blip, but it's something new that we could jump onto.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, I mean, they have, you know, like they have their roots in some of the stuff that would eventually become sort of the Viking metal scene, I guess, at least, you know, too, like that same kind of honesty and like odd, like we pointed out before, that, I don't know, I think folk's the wrong word, that paganistic sort of aspect, you know, where
there's a certain amount of nationalism without being, you know,
without being fascist. Creepy and weird, you know, like it's pridefulness, like, almost, you know,
like it's you know, you look at Toby Keith kind of pride, which is just you know, it's a pride and fuck you to everybody else in the world, but this is kind of like, look at the shit we've gone through, and we're still proud people kind of thing. It's not like, you know, fuck you, we'll impose our will upon the world or whatever.
Well, and I think when we get to the third,
I mean, their nation's been beat up its entire life.
I was going to say, when we get to the Spirit, the Earth, the Flame, I think one of the basic themes of that is sort of the tragedy of the Irish experience, sort of encapsulate it, and then that will kind of continue, especially when we get to the Gathering Wilderness in part 2. But I guess before we go any further, we're going to go through a butcher fest here of the names. But
Ellen Averill vocals.
Yeah, Nemthananga, I think is his.
That used to be kind of his black metal moniker, I think. Yeah, which is pretty interesting.
Cool lesson. And he's the vocalist, and we'll certainly talk about him a little bit. And then we've got Syrian Mikulium. Yeah, on guitars. And he's the original guitar player. And on Imrama, which we'll hear first, there'll be a guy by the name of Fergal Flannery on guitars, but that's the only record that he's on. So.
And then Paul Magale. Thinking of Paul Magale.
I think it's Magale. Paul Magale.
Not the guy from CNN, but
no. And he's the bass player.
And these two guys, Paul. I'm just gonna say Paul and Syrian.
We'll go first names.
They were the guys that started the band in '87 as a death metal band, and then Alan came in and
they used to be called Forsaken, correct?
Yeah.
Primordial. Yeah. And then they had on the debut, not Journey's End, but the one we're about to play, Imrama, they had a different drummer, Derek, I forget his last name, but the main drummer who you heard on Journey's End there was Simon Olager. We'll go with Olagere. Yeah. So we'll say Simon. And he's
pretty much been with them since, hasn't he?
And he's got such an amazing sort of touch. You mentioned like Nico McBrain, or even
he's got a drum vocabulary that he doesn't strive away from too much. But it's one of the few drummers that you can put on that doesn't have like a style like Hellhammer or somebody that as soon as you put it on you can tell who it is, which is I think is kind of a rarity.
Yeah, and they're. I don't think that if you took these guys separate, that they're necessarily musically impressive, but it's this sort of combination of odd pieces, the sort of Iron Maiden riffing with like this odd sort of drummer, a bass player that's actually doing some bottom stuff, and then this vocalist who doesn't really sound like any other vocalist, Alan, who does this such emotive, tortured sort of singing, but yet he can switch, as we'll hear in a moment with Imrama, into some really scary black metal type.
Oh, the black metal, his
stuff,
black metal vocals are some of my favorite. I mean, they're almost as good. Well, I'd put him and Gertla on the same kind of page as far as, I think Alan's got a little bit more of a range as far as like the power behind his vocals, but as far as just how sick the black metal vocals are, just like, holy crap.
Yeah, they're an odd band because you can't. They haven't shed all of their black metal influences that they sort of start with Imrama with, even on the new one that we'll get to. They've never fit like a pattern, like they don't fit into anyone else's scene. I mean, people have tried to compare them to like Moon Sorrow or In the Woods or Bathory gets thrown on a rock.
Sure.
I've sort of thrown out Nagur Bunget, that weird Bulgarian or Romanian black metal band that doesn't really fit with anybody either. So, but that's probably the sort of Irish Celtic thing that's mixed in with black metal that no one else really has.
Similar to to U2, I guess they've had a pretty cemented lineup there, at least the core of it for quite a while. And I think you're onto something talking about the whole idea of just this. If you did take these guys apart, it's all about the unity and what these guys do together, and you can tell the comfort in, I guess, just like they know each other so well musically, that it doesn't necessarily matter if they deviate. The songs are almost set together that way, so you could sit there and you could play some of these songs for 25 minutes, it wouldn't be weird.
I bet a lot of them are improvised in the studio. It sounds
that's kind of how it seems. Like, okay, let's come up with this riff. All right, you got drummer, you always know what you're doing. You're throwing down your thing, and they never typically deviate too much. They almost have this like playbook, but it doesn't come across stale ever.
Well, and there's a real organic quality to their music.
Absolutely.
Is what it sort of comes down to, And then when you get to Imrama, you're going to hear a lot of the sort of pagan black metal roots with the song we're going to hear, which is the first tune, which is Fuil Arsa, which is that Gaelic or Celtic for something? Probably
it's Celtic for something. I mean, Imrama means voyages, and literally it means
it's rowing
about.
Rowing about.
So a journey to some,
that's
or a voyage
cool.
to some degree. But there's a lot of Greek black metal influence on this as well. I can hear Riding Christ and that kind of vibe of just what, especially the second track, which we're not going to play, but there's a definite Greek sound as far as the drum production and just the drum performance in that, which is, it almost kind of has like a weird industrial vibe to it, almost how a lot of the Greek stuff did. Well, a lot of it was drum machine back then, but just the choices that they made they're very calculated, but also kind of messy at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think that gives it that organic nature a little bit though too. Mm-hmm. How messy it was and imperfect in a sense. And then you get into Journey's End, which it took them 3 years to make it, and Journey's End, if you read the liner notes, I mean, there was sort of like a bitterness and melancholy that follows this record. They went through a lot of, I guess, personal tragedies and things that unspecific. I can't speak to exactly what they were, but that's one of the reasons they titled The Journey's End, because they felt like it was an album that was never quite going to be made because of all the shit they were sort of going through. Right before they put Journey's End out, they actually did a really cool 10-inch split with Catatonia, where they had a song called To Enter Pagans, and Catatonia put Scarlet Heavens out too, which is...
It was a live version of To Enter Pagan. Oh, no, that's on one of the CDs, I think.
Is it? Okay.
I think it might be...
On one of the... I think it's the Burning Season EP.
Might be.
That they have on Spirit... at the very end of Spirit, the Earth, the Flames.
Oh, right here, yeah.
Yeah, it's the Burning Season EP that they
I just remember, it's almost like Kingdom Fucking when they open up that song. To enter Pagan!
And so Journey's End is a little bit like, I guess, more, even though it's still dark and melancholy and bitter, it's a little bit more refined.
It's the transition record, right? Until you hit, Spirit of Earth, Aflame is their big. It's kind of their coming out as like, that's their potential at that time, and it really, they don't sound like anybody on that record.
No, and you can definitely tell, like, one of the major factors for Journey's End is how much more confidence Alan gets on this record. You'll hear that. You heard it a little bit in Journey's End, but when you compare the Fuil Arsa song with the song we're going to hear right after that, Autumn's Ablaze from Journey's End, you can tell a major difference vocally and stuff.
And I think he's one of those few, well, I guess kind of right out of the gate, he started doing those kind of vocals, but typically you have a death metal vocalist, black metal vocalist, they try to spread their wings and do something that's always kind of whispery and, I don't know, just
lacks confidence.
Lacks confidence, and they don't kind of embrace the power behind it. And Alan's always had an incredible amount of power behind this stuff. It's like a bunch of drunk guys singing, but he's got almost this intimidation factor to his voice
to me,
as
it's a cross between like Aaron from My Dying Bride and Vincent's sort of like unclean learning how to sing vocals of like Silent Enigma, the sort of torturedness, like the rawness of that, you know. And eventually Vincent became a great vocalist, but you didn't know it at the time. You didn't know what he was going to do. So, but let's get into it. Do it to it with some Imrama from '95. We've got Fuil Arsa, and then we've got Autumn's Ablaze from A Journey's End, and then we'll end with the first of a trio of tracks from Spirit the Earth Aflame, The Burning Season, which we'll talk about when we get back.
Shonda Ursa Ad Riha Lasi Gwivna Glora Winchana Dehra Winchana Nirt Winchana Tola Ikfui Dregda Meltak Nukruna takes forever from the grace of man, and I fell so far. Saw how far I fell from the grave. let us make rivers of their blood. Made for me, I wish it so. And streams shall meet such rivers, and seaward they shall flow.
That was The Burning Season, Autumn's Ablaze, and Fuil Arsa from Primordial. And the last tune you heard there, The Burning Season, strangely enough, they put out an EP in 1999 called The Burning Season, but that song is not on there.
No.
But it can be found on the full length that they put out 1 year later, Spirit, the Earth, Aflame. And that's a record that's pretty near and dear to your heart. And you're sort of the guy that turned me on to Primordial through this record.
I think this was when I was working at the college newspaper. This was along with, God, what else was on this? Like, it might have been a Radiohead record, Red House Painters. This and something else.
It was
an eclectic mix for sure. But no, this is one of those records that you can throw on for almost anybody. I think it's got that kind of appeal, just like a lot of Anathema records do, where you still got the aggressive, stuff going on, but just the honesty to his vocals and the songwriting in this record is just. I don't know if they've ever captured it again.
Yeah, and that sort of rawness level.
This level. I mean, they've done different things and similar things, but this seems like hard on their sleeve, the entire record, like basically flawless as far as I'm concerned.
And I would say, too, you hear a lot of, I guess, doom influences start to kind of creep in on this record, besides The Bride, Anathema, but like I mentioned, even like sort of the muddiness of like a band like Unholy, which is a Finnish sort of like, doom band and stuff like that, and even like the stuff that will come later from Finland, you can hear some roots. They were probably very influenced by Primordial. What's the band that Chris is really, really into that's toured with Opeth before? We've seen them open for Catatonia from Finland.
Oh, Swallow the Sun?
Yeah. There's some, I mean, I can almost hear them being influenced by some of the choices that like a band like Primordial makes, or like actually being fans of the band on some level.
Yeah, and the first couple, I think the first 3 Swallow the Sun records are quite good. And then they do the mistake of trying to sing clean before they have the
Before
chops.
they know what they're doing.
And then it sounds like shit.
Yeah. Rapture did the same thing, but to some limited success too. Another Finnish band that kind of that's trying to push a little too hard.
That's the reason why I think that Alan needs to be kind of spotlighted as being an incredibly important vocalist in the entire scene, because there's not a whole lot of super unique, versatile vocal. Like, Michael Ockerfeld, of course, he can sing both quite well, but there's not a ton that still do it. Stainthorpe from My Dying Bride as well, but he has you either love his vocals or you hate his vocals.
Yeah, he's very divisive.
But I think Alan's much more kind of a welcoming, easier, to penetrate.
He's almost like soulful. I don't know if that's the right word, because it's not like black soul music kind of sounding or anything that, but there's an honest soulfulness there that's really, really endearing,
And just like some of the earlier Catatonia stuff, Rionis was starting to get away from death metal, and his voice would crack, but he would go with it.
Yeah.
Will Oldham kind of stuff, where his voice cracks, but that actually emphasizes what they're trying to do. It kind of reflects the pain or whatever they're trying to reflect.
Well, and I think that's part of, if you go back to the roots of folk music, whether it be like the Woody Guthries of the 30s and 40s, or like the Dylan in the 60s, like it wasn't necessarily
or Squires.
What's it? Yeah, well, it wasn't necessarily like the skill level of the actual vocals. It was the sort of passion and songwriting.
Exactly.
And if you can sell it on that, then people will sort of march behind you.
Well, and go back to like old blues from the earlier part of the 1900s is like, most of those guys aren't really great singers, but they meant every word that came out of their mouth. Sure.
Yeah, and that's the thing you hear here. I mean, like I said before, Spirit, the Earth, Aflame, the vibe I get from it is really this sort of tragedy of Irish history. They're really starting to tap into that. They're moving away from, I guess, the dark romanticism poetry stuff that you heard a little bit on the first couple of records.
They start getting real,
and they're starting to get really, really real. And one thing you hear both on Journey's End and Spirit, the Earth, Aflame that I think needs to be really sort of pointed out and pat these guys on the back is that they have that sort of Celtic pagan metal sort of thing without all the sort of trappings of having to sort of rely on traditional Irish instruments in every song or whatever. Like
they've used like mandolin and stuff before in songs,
but it's really well placed and
but they play. The thing is, they play it the same way they play the guitars.
Yeah,
they play the same riffs. It's just for a different tone or something.
Yep.
So,
and you hear it in a song that we don't have a chance to play that's on this called "The Cruel Sea." It's an instrumental. It's really an unbelievable track, but it's more like, I guess, a traditional arrangement. The other thing that's really neat about Primordial too is they start doing on this record and future records is taking like songs that were like traditional Irish folk songs from like hundreds of years ago, or even like a a song that was a W.B. Yeats poem, and they like write music for it.
Yeah.
So like, again, getting into that heritage thing of like encapsulating what the whole Irish experience and Irish history is, but without going into those sort of cheesy places that a lot of folk metal bands seem to go into today, or at least so-called folk metal bands.
You see, that's the thing, just like progressive metal, that you can either, there's a lot of shit in it, or it's, you know, if you take it to its literal meaning, there can be a lot of good stuff in it as well.
Yeah.
You know, another band that I get a lot of similarities is Neurosis. As far as like the building that Neurosis can do in a song like these guys can do.
Lots
it's very,
of
there's not like, the drums are there just to like to build things up, not necessarily to, you can have like no cymbals hit for, you know, 6 minutes on a song and just kind of builds up like Neurosis does.
And I think to the naysayer, sometimes like it's the first time you play maybe Neurosis for people where they're like, this is kind of boring, but then like you ask them, no, now really listen, like really feel
It's
what's
not
happening.
passive music. Yeah.
You got to really actively participate. And like the song we're going to open up with, which was sort of the song that really, you know, I remember listening to the most, singing along to and stuff, you know, Gods to the Godless, and even The Soul Must Sleep. Both those songs are builders, you know, they're just sort of like building momentum the whole time. And, you know, I mean, that's a quality that you get out of like doom metal and things like that, but not so much in black metal, unless you're talking about Old Enslave, which had the, you know, or Old Ulver, which is like these 10-minute songs or something.
And they build, but they don't build to like, you know, crescendo.
Yeah, and they're not like triumphant at the end. It's more like
it builds
and dark,
like more contemporary Iron Maiden stuff.
Yeah, like the 2000 stuff.
Where you've got songs that are, you know, like 13 minutes long that slowly build this almost like epic poem kind of thing. And I think there's a lot of similarities definitely with Maiden, but even with bass playing and the drumming, it's just a different kind of approach. But it's, I guess, not as quote unquote progressive as Maiden is now. But
yeah. But well, let's get back into some Spirit the Earth, the Flame stuff, and then what we're going to do is play a pair here: Gods to the Godless and The Soul Must Sleep. Both longer tunes. You're not going to find too many short tunes from Primordial. And then we're going to close out with a song called "The Heretic's Age" from Storm Before Calm. And hold on to your horses, because this is a different feeling that they're going to go for on this record. And we'll
it's pretty abrupt.
Talk about that. So.
the flesh of the dead. As the flesh of the dead. An ill wind to bring naught but
The Heretic's Age, The Soul Must Sleep, and Gods to the Godless. And
Kind of sounds like a Danzig song.
yeah, it does.
Godless.
But the Heretic's Age, a different feel altogether from where we just came from.
It's like, okay, you have this triumphant like walk over the countryside being regaled with stories of history, and now you just got, a Mongol horde for some reason managed to jump over there and beat the shit out of you.
Yeah, and you
It's just like right into the confrontation.
Yep, and all of a sudden this black metal tremolo riff sort of comes out, and yet it's mixed with some kind of Celtic harmonies and stuff. It's just it's a weird sounding thing. You've got blast beats kind of going and some awesome screams.
Pretty terrible cover.
It's not a great cover. In fact, it's one of the reasons I had trouble getting into it for a while. I got it as a promo from Hammerheart, I think I was getting service from.
Yeah.
And it just it didn't do much. It sat around for a while, but the layout's nice once you're inside, like the color scheme and things like that. It's just not a great cover. This
was an era of graphic design where everybody was doing embossing, lettering, and doing a lot of unnecessary shading and stuff.
Sure.
Where it looks, because if you took off the bad lettering, it looks like a Neurosis EP.
Yeah, that's
or
true.
Something,
That's true. Yep. And the problem with Storm Before Calm is a kind of an uneven record. It's got some black metal tunes like the tune you just heard, and then there's a song called What Sleeps Within, which is really like pure black metal stuff. You've got some just random instrumentals that are kind of thrown in, and then you've got a song like we're going to end with in a moment, Sons of Morrigan, which is more sort of like epic, kind of the style that you were hearing before, but with almost more upbeatness to it.
But still, the production value is completely different.
Yeah, it's much cleaner production. It's not as like muddy, doomy.
But
as
it's compressed.
What you heard. Yeah,
too. Like the sound wave seems very compressed.
Yeah.
It doesn't breathe as much, I guess.
And I think the problem that this album has is it's always going to be looked upon as the awkward album in between two masterpiece records. Which
it's just like
Aflame and Gathering Wilderness.
What's the Enslaved record that I love that most people hate? No.
Yeah. I know exactly.
With them on the cover.
Yeah, Bloodheim.
Yeah. I love that record. Yeah, and people hate it.
And that's in between these two sort of like transitional records, Eld and Martin.
Yeah, totally.
So, and there's nothing, I mean, any Primordial is good Primordial. That's the thing. They're a band that's so consistent. There's no such thing as a bad Primordial.
Yeah, there's no turd. So if you find one used that you don't have, buy it.
Yeah, just get it. But I think the energy on this record, I would say, is primal. If the last one was more sort of the tragedy of Irish experience or sort of paganism versus Christianity, battles and stuff, this is much more primal,
and they seem really pissed off.
Yeah, they're angry about something, I mean, there's a pridefulness too, there's a lot of strength and Irish pride that's kind of coming out in that primal nature and stuff, but it's a diverse record. It refines and reflects on a lot of the things they've done prior, including the black metal stuff, the death metal, the doom metal, and then the sort of pagan metal. It just doesn't seem like, it almost seems like they don't know which direction they want to go on this record. Yeah,
they're almost like kind of resting on past laurels or something too, like going back to what's comfortable, and then slowly kind of integrating some more of that stuff. Because I mean, after putting out Spirit of Earth, Aflame, that's kind of like having a kid. Like, what do you do after that? I can go jogging a little bit. Who knows? To get back in shape.
Yeah, definitely tough to know what to do, And I mean, luckily for us, we don't have to wait long for kind of them to get back on track, and we'll sort of talk about that in part 2 down the road. But this is a good way to sort of end and hopefully give you a nice introduction to this band. And one of the reasons I'm kind of pumped to do this show is because I truly believe this might be one of those bands that a lot of people who listen to the podcast might not have a great familiarity with, and might have heard a song or two, but maybe they were turned away because they heard the term folk metal applied, and it's definitely not what like people like you and I think of when we hear folk metal, which is this really sort of cheesy, like Finnish troll music or whatever the hell. Fintroll.
I don't even know what they sound like, but that sounds like it could be that.
Yeah, just and so hopefully let us know, shoot us an email, requiempodcast@gmail.com, shoot us something on iTunes or throw a comment up on Facebook about what you're thinking about, Primordial thus far, and if this is sort of a game changer for you, because I truly believe these guys deserve a lot more than what they have. And
it's not like they're an obscure band, but to look at their track, their track record really is how many good records they put out. And I know a lot of people, they're not, do some more weird, obscure stuff. Well, there's only so much you can talk about a weird, obscure band that has one record out.
Yeah.
A band like this actually has a history that, I've been listening to them since 95 or something, or maybe before. And, just like actually going back and penetrating the stuff and not just like, I've seen these guys around forever. I don't really care.
Yeah.
But actually, this is a band that I think is really definitely worth, your attention.
Yep. And a good way to sort of close out this beginning era, their sort of phase one.
Sons of Morrigan.
Sons of Morrigan. And about at the 2:20 mark, you're going to hear a sweet yell. Awesome, like kind of Tom Araya-esque Show No Mercy or something like that.
Very close to that.
It's pretty nifty. So, but yeah, let us know what you thought and be in touch with us. And, we always like to hear your comments. If you want to be an executive producer on some of these episodes, requiempodcast.com, and you can find some merch and other cool things up there. So,
and if you want to be really cool, you can go to my Kickstarter page, which is linked on the site, requiempodcast.com right now. I'm doing an H.P. Lovecraft adaptation of Dagon. So if you're interested in that, you can check out that for more information, and that'd be much appreciated. We've already had several. I know 3 particular listeners of the podcast that have helped out.
Kind of been into it. Yeah.
So it's been very nice.
Yeah. So we appreciate those generous people out there that have been helping us out and making our jobs a little bit easier.
Brothers of Metal, unite.
So enjoy Sons of Morrigan from Primordial, Storm Before Calm.